In the autumn of 2018, engineers detonated the first of 5 dams on the Aller River in Lower Saxony. The demolition took weeks. The concrete came down in sections, the rubble was cleared, and for the first time in 130 years, the river ran unbroken from the mountains to the sea. Nobody expected results quickly. The scientists who authorized the project told the press it would take a generation to know whether it had worked. 18 months later, a fish that had not been seen in that river since the age of the Kaiser pushed upstream through the current, found the gravel beds its ancestors had used and spawned. What happened in the 3 years after that forced the team behind the demolition to revise nearly everything they had predicted. To understand why 5 concrete dams had to come down, do you have to understand what the Aller River was before they went up, and how thoroughly a century of infrastructure erased it. The Aller is a tributary of the Weser, running roughly 260 kilometers through the flat agricultural lowlands of northern Germany, before joining the larger river near Verden. For most of human history, it was one of the most productive salmon rivers in Central Europe. German fisheries records from the 18th and early 19th century document Atlantic salmon, runs so dense in autumn that farmers netted them by the cartload and used them as field fertilizer. Local parishes recorded the salmon runs the way they recorded harvests, as a reliable annual event that the community structured its autumn around. The fish were not a curiosity. They were infrastructure. Their bodies, decaying in the shallows after spawning, fed the riparian forest, the insects, the birds, and the invertebrates that kept the river system cycling through nutrients year after year. Every link in that chain depended on the salmon returning from the North Sea each autumn, finding the river mouth, and pushing upstream to the gravel beds where they had been born. The last confirmed natural salmon spawn in the Aller was recorded in 1892, not in the mid-20th century, when industrial pollution became the story most people associate with European river degradation. 1892. The cause was not chemicals or warming water, it was concrete. Between the 1830s and the 1880s, a series of weirs and dams were constructed along the Aller and its tributaries, first for milling, then for flood control, then for small-scale hydroelectric generation. Each structure was modest in height, and none of them would have impressed a civil engineer even at the time of their construction. But for an Atlantic salmon, height is not the relevant variable. What matters is passability, and these structures were not passable. Atlantic salmon return to spawn in the exact tributary, often the exact gravel bed, where they were born. They navigate by olfactory memory, following the precise chemical signature of their natal water upstream from the sea. A weir that drops the water level by a single meter in a fast current is not an inconvenience. It is a wall. By the time the last dam was in place, the Aller's salmon had nowhere to go. The spawning grounds in the upper reaches sat empty, year after year, until the fish that remembered them died, and no new generation was born to replace them. The runs collapsed within a single generation of the final dam's completion, and they did not recover. What the salmon's absence did to the river took longer to become visible, but it was no less damaging. The annual nutrient pulse that returning fish bodies had provided to the riparian ecosystem, phosphorus and nitrogen drawn from the sea and deposited in the river's floodplain, disappeared. Invertebrate populations that had depended on stable riverbed conditions and the decomposition cycles accelerated by fish carcasses declined steadily. River lamprey, which spend part of their life cycle parasitizing migratory fish at sea before returning to spawn in the same river gravels, vanished from the upper reaches within decades of the dams going up. Otters, which had historically hunted salmon in the upper Aller, are retreated to the lower river where coarse fish remained available, and then largely disappeared from the catchment altogether as habitat quality fell. The river continued to flow, continued to hold water, continued to look from a bridge like a functioning river. But the ecology beneath the surface had been quietly dismantling itself for more than a century before anyone began systematically measuring what was missing. By the early 2000s, Germany faced a reckoning that was simultaneously ecological and legal. The European Union's Water Framework Directive, adopted in 2000, required all member states to achieve good ecological status across their river networks, a mandate that included the restoration of migratory fish passage on barriers blocking historically significant migration routes. German federal assessments identified the Aller as one of the most ecologically degraded catchments in Lower Saxony, with its salmon and lamprey populations listed as locally extinct, and its invertebrate communities rated poor across multiple monitoring cycles. The 5 dams blocking the river were subjected to economic review. The milling operations they had originally powered no longer existed. The flood control function they served could be replicated by alternative management on the lower river. The hydroelectric generation the 5 structures combined produced was negligible, enough to power roughly 200 households at a maintenance cost that made the energy economically marginal at best. Against the scale of EU non-compliance exposure and the accumulated evidence of ecological damage, the case for keeping the dams was difficult to sustain. The Niedersächsischer Landesbetrieb für Wasserwirtschaft, Küsten- und Naturschutz, the State Water Management Authority for Lower Saxony, authorized the removal program in 2016. 2 years of engineering surveys, environmental impact assessments, and stakeholder consultations followed. In the autumn of 2018, the first dam came down. What happened to the river in the weeks immediately following each demolition was itself unexpected. Engineers had modeled a period of significant turbidity, 130 years of accumulated fine sediment releasing from the former reservoir pools and moving downstream in a disruptive pulse. What they observed was faster and more self-organized than any of their projections had suggested. Within days of each removal, the river began reworking its own bed, yet the current, freed to move at its natural velocity through sections that had been pooled and slow for over a century, began sorting the substrate, carrying fine silts downstream and leaving the coarser gravel that salmon and lamprey require for successful spawning and larval development. The river was, without any engineering intervention, rebuilding the conditions that had made it productive before the dams went up. Biologists from the University of Göttingen, monitoring the riverbed under contract with the state authority, documented clean, well-oxygenated gravel patches appearing in former dam pool zones within 3 months of demolition. The timeline in their field notes reflected their surprise. They had planned to begin looking for suitable spawning substrate in year 3 of the monitoring program. They were finding it in month 3. The first salmon arrived in spring 2020. A monitoring team from the Arbeitsgemeinschaft zur Wiederherstellung der Wanderfischfauna, a consortium established specifically to track the Aller's migratory fish recovery, documented the upstream movement using fish counters and underwater cameras installed at stations along the newly opened river corridor. The numbers in the first season were modest, several dozen individuals, most of them young adults whose parents had been part of a stocking program operating in the lower Weser system. But these fish traveled further upstream than any stocking-supported migration on record for this catchment. They moved past the footprint of all 5 demolished dams, through sections of river that had been blocked since the 1880s, and into the upper Aller tributaries, where the newly sorted gravel waited. There they built redds, the shallow fan depressions in clean gravel where Atlantic salmon deposit their eggs, in water their species had not used for reproduction in over 130 years. The monitoring team photographed the redds and submitted the images as the first documented evidence of natural salmon reproduction in the Upper Aller since 1892. By the 2021 season, the returning fish count had grown substantially. In 2022, river lamprey were recorded in the upper reaches for the first time in the entire history of systematic biological monitoring in this catchment, a result that carried particular significance because lamprey are notoriously demanding in their habitat requirements. They need stable, silt-free gravel for spawning, long stretches of clean sandy substrate for larval development, and unobstructed river corridors for their parasitic sea migration phase. Their presence in a river system is not a sign that conditions are improving. It is a sign that conditions have already substantially recovered. The monitoring team's invertebrate surveys told the same story. Species richness in the gravel substrate was increasing each year, with pollution-sensitive taxa, the stoneflies, mayflies, and caddisflies, that disappear first from degraded rivers and return last, reappearing in sections that had shown none of them a decade earlier. What the Allah's recovery exposed was an assumption embedded in European river restoration science that the project's results now call into question. The prevailing model had held that the longer a river system runs degraded, the longer and less predictable its recovery. The Allah had been blocked for 130 years. On the accepted model, meaningful ecological recovery should have been decades away. Instead, the river's response compressed those projections dramatically, apparently because the underlying geomorphology of the riverbed retained enough structural integrity to reorganize quickly once the flow regime was restored, and because fish populations in connected parts of the Weser system were available to colonize the newly opened habitat before it had time to degrade again. The system had a resilience that the damage of 130 years had not extinguished. It had simply been waiting for an opening. That finding has moved quickly through the German water management community. The Federal Environment Agency's 2022 dam inventory identified more than 100 additional obsolete structures on rivers across the country as viable removal candidates. Projects on the Rhine, Elbe, and Weser tributaries are in various stages of assessment and permitting. The political obstacles, heritage classifications, property disputes, agricultural water use agreements are real and in some cases substantial. The Allah's recovery has not dissolved them, but it has made the ecological argument for removal considerably harder to dismiss in rooms where those arguments were previously routine to ignore. The salmon count on the Aller rises each season. The lamprey are expanding their range upstream. Somewhere in the gravel of the upper tributaries, in reds that no living person had seen before 2020, the next generation of Atlantic salmon is developing toward a river that was written off in 1892 and is now, by every biological measure available, coming back. 5 dams, 130 years, 18 months to the first returning fish. The river did not need rescuing, it needed the walls taken down.